published author. And so this has kind of been a little bit of a like dream come true for me.
We all know you're younger than me. Yeah, and I loved you in another life. It's probably my favorite YA novel of the year. I just loved it so much, and I will admit, I agreed to this tour before I read it, so it was a big relief when I was like, holy shit, this book is amazing. So it is amazing to share stage with you.
Yeah, so we'll each talk a little bit about our books, and then we'll each read a little bit from our books. We'll have a couple of questions for each other, and then we'll open it up for you guys to have some questions. So be thinking of questions if you have them.
Do
you, David?
Do you want me to start?
Yes.
Well, luckily I chose my section. So I was saying to David at lunch, I was like, I'm not going to read from the same chapter I always read from. And then, of course, many of you, when you came in, might have seen me in the corner hastily flipping through my own book, trying to figure out.
And his clock ticks very loudly on his watch.
But yeah, so I'm here with Ryan and Avery, which is my new book. It is a companion of sorts, although you certainly do not have to read the other book, to my book, Two Boys Kissing. And it is a companion of sorts because the characters Ryan and Avery appear first in Two Boys Kissing. We see their first 2 dates and then sort of a coda of their 3rd date in Two Boys Kissing. And I wrote that book. I was very happy with where I left them and had not really planned on ever writing them again. And then something happened when I went to London. I was on tour and I had an event, not unlike this one, at a bookstore in London. And during the Q&A, a trans teen named Noah raised his hand and asked a question that was more of a statement with a question mark at the end, which was, you're going to write more about Ryan and Avery, right? And until that nanosecond of that question, the answer was absolutely no. It hadn't even occurred to me that I would write any more about these characters. But from the sincere desire in his voice, and then talking to him afterwards about what the characters meant to him, I was like, well, that's interesting. Conveniently, even though it is a massive, massive pain when February rolls around, every year since my junior year of high school, which was many years ago, I write a story for my friends for Valentine's Day. And so in next February 14th, I wrote the 5th date that Ryan and Avery went on. So it wasn't the date from the book, and it wasn't even the date after the dates from the book. It was just jumping to the future. And I wrote it for Noah, sent it to Noah, sent it to a bunch of my friends, and then thought I would continue. And I love that as a starting point. So in this book, we see Ryan and Avery's first 10 dates, but we start with the 5th, go to the 6th, then go back to the 4th, and jump to the 7th, and jump back to the 3rd, and sort of see them in that kind of back and forth sequence so that we end with the 1st date and the 10th date. And I did that because I didn't want anyone who had read the first book to be reading the same thing they'd already read with the first 2 dates. But also, I really wanted to focus on every single date and really get into the minutiae of every single moment of those dates. This book took 8 years for me to write, which is ridiculous because it's 2 boys on 10 dates. It should not take that long, but it was because I was so micro-focused and I really did not want to rush it. I really wanted to live in the book for as long as I could. So that's sort of the preface. So I'm actually going to pick up with the 3rd date, which is actually in Two Boys Kissing, again, sort of glancingly, but it is in there. But that book has a very strong narrative voice, whereas this is more just following the characters. Suddenly there's music. All right, so what you need to know is that Ryan and Avery met at a gay prom. They're from towns that are 2 hours away from each other. And so Avery has basically driven over to Ryan's town to just hang out. Ryan, of course, was very excited about this, and then Avery arrives, and he's like, there's nowhere in this town to hang out, and doesn't know where to take him. Ryan's parents are not very accepting of Ryan, so home is not an option. So they're driving around, and then Ryan figures out where to go. And that is where we'll pick up. I will also point out that as I'm getting older, I need reading glasses, and I forgot to bring them. So this will be interesting. It's all a blur to me. All right. Ryan directs Avery to Mr. Footer's, an old relic of a miniature golf course on the outskirts of town, a neighborhood where not even warehouses bother to exist. The mini golf course has been closed for years now, and no one else has bought the land, so it sits in its abandoned state, nearly post-apocalyptic in its decay. There's a lock on the gates, but the gates have undone themselves in places, making it easy to come and go. At night, it's a breeding ground for misdeeds, but during the day, it's graveyard quiet. Where exactly are you taking me? Avery asks. Ryan has a flash of seeing the site through his eyes and understands this might be a mistake, but he doesn't want to turn back now. He tells Avery to park in front. When I was a kid, he explains, this was the best place around. Like, if you were really good and did all your chores, Mom and Dad would take you here. You'd play all the mini golf you could, and then there'd be ice cream and video games in the hut over there. Avery takes it all in. So what happened? Ryan shrugs. One day it was here, and then the next day there was a sign saying it was over. It's sat here ever since. But still, Ryan wants to say, it's kind of the same. Like an old stuffed animal. Just because it's now a ragged version of itself, you don't stop loving it. You might not keep it with you like you used to, but you're still nostalgically happy to see it. Do you come here often? Avery asks. He makes it sound like a line from a dive bar. Only with special people, Ryan replies. It sounds sarcastic, but it's actually sincere. Oh, gee, I'm so flattered. Avery deadpans. Let's go, Ryan says. They leave the car and walk along the fence until Ryan finds a gap big enough to slide through. He pretends to be a gentleman holding a door open for Avery. Inside, everything is broken. Toppled windmills, fetid moats, bottles left smashed, and cans left crushed. Want to play? Avery asks. Ryan looks at the torn up greens, the holes filled with cigarette burns. I'm not sure that'll work, he says. There aren't any clubs anymore, or golf balls. Avery has what can only be called a mischievous gleam in his eye. So it's hard to play mini golf without those things? Use your imagination. Avery walks to the base of the first green and puts down an invincible ball. This is the most amazing mini golf course ever created. For example, this hole is patrolled by live alligators. If they swallow your ball, it'll cost you 3 strokes. And if they swallow you, it's 5. Avery takes an exaggerated swing with a non-existent club, then makes a production of watching the ball soar into the air and drop to the green. Come on, he murmurs. Then he sighs. Not a hole in one, but at least I dodged the gators. Your turn. Ryan wants to kiss Avery on the spot for sending their day on this diversion. But he doesn't want to interrupt the imaginary game, so walks over and puts down his own invisible ball. I hope you don't mind that I took the pink one, he says. I don't mind at all. Ryan swings at the ball. They both watch it rise and drop. Not bad, Avery says, at least I didn't hit a gator. Ryan thinks Avery will stop there, will want to leave this desolate place. But he heads right over to his ball and makes the putt, then steps out of the way for Ryan to take his imaginary turn. Ryan follows his lead, but misses the shot. He gets the next one in. Avery makes a gesture of gathering the golf balls from the hole, then walks to the next green. Your turn, he says. What's the story? Are you kidding? Do you mean to tell me you haven't heard of the famous fonduicular folly? Wait, Avery gasps. You mean to tell me that's here? Yes. You might not be able to see them with your very limited human sight, but this green is riddled with troughs of gooey chocolate. If a golf ball falls in, it will taste better, if you're into that kind of thing, but will also slow you down. Which is why we've switched our golf balls out for golf ball-sized gobstoppers. They're not as aerodynamic, but they are easier to clean with your tongue. Excellent. I only played with marshmallows, but gobstoppers roll better. Ryan lets Avery go first. Go ahead. For a moment, it's like the greens are greens and the flags are aloft. The thing is, At this point, Ryan's used to it being wrecked. He's even appreciated how derelict it was when he was feeling pretty derelict himself. In the past couple of years, there's been some catharsis in seeing his childhood so visibly trashed, as if there was some confirmation here about what growing up should feel like. He wasn't lying when he told Avery he'd only brought special people here, but he could just as easily have said he's never brought anyone here, not since it closed. This is also true. He's only come by himself since he had his license and his truck and needed a destination other than his house. He's always been careful to make sure there weren't any other cars around, so he could experience the park in solitude, as if he were wandering around in the inside of his head. It made him feel less alone, to feel his absences so powerfully. Mostly because it's a confirmation that this town is a place he needs to leave. It isn't him that's broken. He still lives, breathes, hopes. It's just that the landscape is dead around him. These are teenage thoughts. Ryan knows this. And with Avery, a little of the old childhood wonder peeks through the clouds. Why experience a place like this as a clear-eyed adolescent when you can engage with it as a dream-eyed kid, seeing castles in every cloud, chocolate in every hiding place? Ryan plays along, and it's a relief to be playing for once. By the fifth hole, they're not even golfing anymore. They're just describing all the things they don't really see. Avery erects the Taj Mahal on hole 5, and Ryan presents the world's first anti-gravity mini-golf on hole 6. At hole 7, they start walking hand in hand, surveyors of what's become a theme park of their own design. Instead of solemnly holding hands, mourning pose, they swing them back and forth, stretch their bodies away from each other, and then pull back together. The sun isn't shining, but they think it is.
So my new book is called I Loved You in Another Life, and it is about two strangers who start hearing music out of thin air. Separately, their lives are sort of falling apart, and they just start hearing these songs. And at first they think they're just totally losing it, but when they start listening to the songs, they recognize that the lyrics are geographically specific. And so then when they start following some of those places, it ends up leading them to each other and they fall in love. But it is kind of a slow burn before they fall in love. And then also throughout the book, there are these short sort of vignette short stories that are told about two people falling in love across space and time, across the globe and throughout history, in supernatural ways. And so you start to realize that these are the same two souls falling in love, dying, falling in love, dying. So it really focuses on the two main characters, Evan and Shosh, in the book, but you see sort of a zoomed out expression of their love in these other souls all across the world and throughout history. And part of that was, like if you're in a museum and you're right up close on a painting and you recognize all of the details and all of the ways that brushstrokes kind of meld into other brushstrokes, and you see all of the smallest details of the painting and you love it, but then you step back and you realize that it's one of a series of paintings. And so maybe you don't see the other paintings in the same amount of detail, but knowing that it's part of a series kind of lends a new perspective to the painting that you do know about. So these short stories kind of told throughout the book, even though they're different from Evan and Shosh's story, kind of put a new spin on Evan and Shosh's character. So there were two sort of, sorry, actually, if I'm squirmy, it's because I saw a picture of myself recently and I was like, do I sit like that? I look like a sad turtle. So if I'm trying to like not have such bad posture. Yeah, okay, yeah.
That'll really affect your book sales if people think you have bad postures.
Right, okay, well, maybe we should just leave it. So there were two sort of seeds of this book. The first was just the idea of two strangers hearing music out of thin air. I had that idea a long time ago and it just sort of sat on a computer for years. And then when it occurred to me that, oh, maybe these two people could fall in love, I thought that could be my way into a love story. This is my 5th book, and I've written about love in my other books, but I haven't centered a true love story. And I've been wanting to do that, but I needed the right kind of idea for that, the right kind of conduit. And so the idea of two strangers hearing music, I thought if those songs could almost act as like a map to each other, that was something I found very just intriguing. And then the other one was just, so I have a kid, and he's the most wonderful, weird little kid ever. He's 11 now, but I started writing this book a long time ago, and I also have a very deeply sentimental streak. And when he was 6, he was obsessed with the movie E.T. It was the only movie he would ever watch. And my wife teaches an aerobics class every Tuesday night. And so since he was born, every Tuesday night is daddy night. We watch a movie, I cook, or we order pizza or something, and that's been what we do for his entire life. But when he was 6, for about 5 months, every week, we watched E.T. When you watch the same movie 20 times in a row, you start to pick up on some things. And one of those viewings, it occurred to me, so the statute of limitations on spoilers for E.T. has long since passed, so I'm going to tell you how it ends, if you don't already know. But E.T. is abandoned on Earth, and this 10-year-old Elliot is trying to help him get home. And in the end, he does. Yay, E.T. got home. The camera zooms in on Elliot's face, and you're like, oh shit, this kid's all alone now. Like, he didn't have any friends, really. His older brother's kind of a jerk. His mom's doing her best, but she's a single mom of 3 kids with a job. The dad's out of the picture. And so I had this idea that would be set like 7 years later, when Elliot, the kid, decides he wants to rebuild that machine and call E.T. Like, he misses his friend. But it's intellectual property, right? So if I wanted to write a story in someone else's story, I had to get that permission. So I typed up a little paragraph and I sent it to my agent. I was like, this is an idea, I'd love to do it, what do you think? And he said, well, I don't know, let's ask your film agent. So he sent it to the film agent. And a couple hours later, I got an email back from her that said, yeah, this is a good idea, let me ask Steven. And I was like, oh, okay. So for those who don't know, Steven Spielberg is the director of E.T. And so she went and asked Steven Spielberg. And then like a couple days later, I got an email that just said, I'm so sorry, Steven said no. And because my kid is who my kid is, and because I am who I am, and because my wife knows we are who we are, when I turned around and said, guys, Steven Spielberg said no to me, we knew it was party time. Like, I had asked a question and Steven Spielberg answered me. But in the process of that, I realized that the story that I really wanted to tell and that I needed to tell wasn't set in the E.T. universe. It was about 2 people coming together every week after week after week to watch E.T. And that was something I didn't need anybody's permission to tell. So the book is a love story about Evan and Shosh and about Evan and Shosh's souls finding each other over and over and over again. But it's also Evan's little brother, Will, is based on my kid. And their relationship is very much a father's attempt to put his 6-year-old in a bottle and just time capsule it for all of eternity, which is what I've done. So on that note, I'm going to read a section that picks up with Evan and Will's Bubba night, because they're brothers, not father-son, but it is very based on, I'm gonna just take the flag off altogether. So yeah, we're picking up with Evan knocking on his little brother's door to start Bubba night. A prolonged rustle from deep within the belly of the cardboard rock. Oh, you know what? I think I'm going to start up here, actually. Never mind. Rewind. Here we go. Last year, we got a new refrigerator, and honestly, I'm not sure who was more ecstatic. Mom over the automatic ice maker, or Will over the giant box it came in. After raiding the house of every flashlight and roll of aluminum foil, and then attaching those items in strategic places on the refrigerator box, he wound up constructing a very impressive rendering of E.T.'s spaceship. Much to Mom's dismay, he then took a Sharpie to either side of his new spaceship and drew 2 large words right on the walls, phone and home. My kid didn't do that, by the way. The kid would live in a refrigerator box if we let him. Will, would you mind exiting the spacecraft for a second? A prolonged rustle from deep within the belly of the cardboard rocket. Eventually, his little head pops out of a side window. Wispy white skin, shaggy brown hair that I still can't figure out which way to part, bright blue eyes and long eyelashes that induce something akin to love at first sight in most everyone he meets. To look at Will is to experience firsthand that people are generally good, that life is a beautiful gift. Right away, you know he's a sweet kid, a soft, too good for this world kid. And I'm not just saying this because he's my favorite human on earth, but there's a light in his face, a look that somehow feels happy and sad all at once, heavy and featherweight, like a candle burning from the bottom of a well. And he may leave a mess wherever he goes and occasionally forget to stop talking, but I love him more than anything loves anything else. There you are, I say. Here I am. I missed you today, bud. I missed you too. And suddenly I notice, no Band-Aids. I try to hide my surprise, pretend like the absence of Band-Aids is no big deal. I don't know if you heard me about the coupons, but I'm thinking we skip breadsticks tonight and spring for delivery. Not really in the mood to go pick it up, you know? I wait for something, anything, but he just stands there looking at me, wearing 0 Band-Aids. Plus, I say, I'm really in the mood for E.T. tonight. Feels right, don't you think? Will tilts his head. I thought you said you needed a break from E.T. I changed my mind. To be clear, Will keeps Reese's Pieces in his desk, wears a red hoodie every day, and is probably the only second grader who rides his bike to school. It's only a block and a half, but still, it took some convincing before Mom agreed. The straw that broke her back was when he declared, I'm an E.T. kid, Mom. E.T. kids ride bikes. E.T. kids ride bikes. How do you argue with that? What do you think, I ask? Should I cue up the movie? He does that thing where his head sways a little and he closes his eyes as if everything rides on the answer to this question. No, he says, and then quietly, I've already cried today. He gives me a half smile and ducks back inside the spaceship. I just stand there with my heart in my shoes. After a few seconds of listening to him rustle around inside his giant cardboard box, I say, okay, and then follow that up with the only thing I've got in me. I'll be right here. There's this scene in E.T. where the kid, Elliot, cuts his finger on a blade, a little pinprick of blood. He holds it up and says, ouch, and E.T. raises his own finger, all lit up like a firefly, and heals Elliot's cut just by touching it. In the background, Elliot's mom reads Peter Pan to Elliot's little sister. Tinkerbell is dying, and the only way to save her is to clap your hands and say you believe. A week after Dad left, Will walked out of the bathroom covered in Band-Aids. Mom and I were concerned, obviously, but he acted completely normal, as if being covered from head to toe in tiny bandages was a perfectly reasonable way of life. In the year or so since, he's only referred to them a handful of times, and never as Band-Aids, always as ouch shields. I'm not afraid of big love. And maybe it's weird for a 17-year-old to think this way, but sometimes I worry what kind of dad I'll be. I worry because a dad should love his kid more than anyone else on the planet, and as far as I'm concerned, that position is filled. I worry because when I hug Will, I feel the fragility of his life, and I imagine him as a tiny bone bird in the middle of a raging storm, and I wish I could save him by clapping my hands and saying I believe, but I can't. I wish I could tell him his ouch shields will protect him, but I can't do that either. The truth is, fragile things rarely fare well in the world. More often, they fare well to it.
All right.
So
let's ask each other questions we have not asked before.
Are there any left?
I mean, I think there's some. I can compare with you.
Okay.
So I'm going to start because I haven't asked you this, and I'm fascinated by the choice. So again, our 2 main characters are Evan and Church, and we pretty much alternate between them. Yet you've chosen to write Evan's chapters in first person and Shosh's in third person. So I'm curious about what, instead of doing 2, he said, she said, instead it is sort of I said and she said.
Yeah, I don't know if it was like an intentional decision on the front end. I know that I started with Evans, and that we talked about this in the car actually. This, not your question, but this, what I'm about to say. I tend to, a lot of times my first pages come out pretty quickly, and I kind of like to just leave them. So I try not to just edit to over and over and over again the first page. So that first page came out of me and it was Evan's voice and it was first person. And so that was always the way that Evan's chapters were going to be for me. And then I think with Shosh, I tried, so before the book even starts, Shosh's sister has died. And so her story is one that's just centered around grief. And in fact, it was kind of a hard thing throughout the book. Evan has a big support system. His mom is there. He's got a great group of friends. Shosh has really just turned in on herself. And so I don't know if maybe because of her sort of isolation, if I felt like maybe some distance was appropriate or, I'm not really sure. I know you've done alternating points of view. Have you ever mixed tenses in your books before? And was it intentional?
I mean, I don't know that I've ever done that. Although you could easily go to the book and decide that I'm wrong. I also don't have memory of half the books that I've written. No, that part of the reason I was surprised by that was that it was an interesting counterpoint, but something was a little bit off.
Yeah.
And it does make sense. And that again, so she is a little bit more distant. She's also, she's drunk. And in many of the scenes that we see her in, she would not be the most reliable first-person narrator. So that also factored into it to me of being like, okay, I actually need to observe Shosh because Shosh is not actually observing herself very well right now.
Yeah, no, that could be for sure. I also know that, I've read plenty of books where there are alternating points of views from first person, and I've not had a problem with it. But my second novel was alternating points of views, both from first person, and I struggled a lot. Like I would be in the middle of a chapter and be like, oh wait, I can't say this here because I'm not in the right person's head. And so there is something a little bit easier. It's a more obvious transition when you're switching tenses as well. I don't know. So things we haven't talked about.
They won't know.
They won't know.
So you need to go for it.
Well, so I've said this to you many times, but as I was reading Ryan and Avery, my wife kept asking me what was so funny. And it was just that my mouth was just like this the whole time. Or not the whole time, but for much of the time. It feels like such a joyful book. And I have been so fortunate to have been able to read some of those Valentine's stories. And so it was cool reading the book and seeing components of it that I had read, before. So you mentioned it took 8 years to write. So here's a question for you, because he has written other books during those 8 years and has also edited many books during those 8 years. Was it, how often did you find yourself returning to Ryan and Avery during those 8 years? Was it an intentional sort of like, okay, it's time, I need to go back? Or was it, what was that process like? I'm trying to imagine because I feel like you wouldn't want to say it was like on the back burner. You had many things going at once. So what was the draw, or was there a signal that went off? You're like, it's time to go back to Ryan and Avery's story.
The honest answer is that much of the book was written for the Valentine deadline, that I would, December would come around and I'd be like, oh, I need to start working on a Valentine's story. I did a Ryan and Avery story last year. I won't do another one this year. And then January would come around and I'd be like, early January, oh no, I should try something different. But Ryan and Avery would already be planning a date in my head. And then by the middle or end of January, when the clock was ticking, you'd be like, okay, time for them to go on another date. And so that really kept me coming back to that world, honestly, was the short story aspect of it, that I wanted every date to sort of be its own piece. And because I could write them that way, when the Valentine deadline came, or there was some other reason for me to write a Ryan and Avery story, that's what I would do. And then I think by the time I had 4 or 5, I was like, okay, this is a novel. I should now just write the rest of them. And those came quicker. But that was really the pacing, was they were always there. And I think the reason I could write it the way that I did was because I got to know them very, very well. In that way that, again, it's like knowing a friend, that you just understand them in a way that you don't understand somebody you meet. And so that helped. I'm curious about, so there are throughout the book, there are these, not vignettes, but there are these sort of stories of the past lives, and sort of the mysterious song that weaves them all together. So I'm curious about, I mean, they are not set necessarily in the obvious places or the obvious times. It isn't like the greatest hits of history, like, oh, here's the Civil War, here's Pearl Harbor, here, like, it is, you put them in some obscure corners. And I don't necessarily want to give all of them away, but I'm curious about how you did choose where you would put your lovers, and were they places and times you'd always wanted to write about, or did you just sit down and surprise yourself and be like, oh my gosh, Norway, who knew I'd be writing something set in Norway? How did that work?
Well, I think that it started with, so Shosh, one of her sort of drunk activities is writing little couplets to Instagram posts of cabins in snow. She gets really into snowy cabins, which is totally something that I'm into. I feel very strongly that like I could totally live in a cabin in the snow. I don't know the first thing about it. I'm not outdoorsy at all, but I could definitely do it. I mean, look how cute and like cozy it looks. And so I kind of gave that to Shosh. And when I realized that, so all of these stories are different, are the same two souls, but in different bodies and different genders and different sexualities and different, but there had to be some through lines. And I knew that kind of early on. And so I really wanted, because of the cabins in snow, I kind of thought, okay, well, maybe someplace north could be like where the original souls are from. And so the original story actually takes place in Paris in the 19th century, because I read a book called The Greater Journey by David McCullough, which is a fantastic account of the pilgrimage that so many artists and medical professionals made in the 1800s to Paris. And when you made that voyage, it was for years, because you took a boat and you risked your life to get there. And I thought Paris during that time, that would be a great place for the story. And to actually have someone from a boat kind of arriving in Paris and not speaking the language. And so the original soul kind of picks up from this woman from Norway. You don't really know her story until the very end. But so then Norway became, okay, I need to have, all of the characters need to have some tie to Norway. Either they're from there or they're going there, or they meet someone that's from there. And then, and then also there is one of the people in the short stories is an historical person, an artist herself, in fact. And I don't want to tell you who it is because I don't want to spoil that. But the minute I made that decision, everything else had to line up, because when you base something in history, right, you're now confined a little bit, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So it became a guessing game of, okay, if it's the same two souls, they need to have lived X number of years for their life in order to have died in time to be reborn. So you kind of have to space it out like that. But it was fun, but also a little complicated.
All right, I have one more question, and then we're going to open it up. So we're going to try to avoid the awkward moment where I turn and like, who has a question? And then we all stare at each other for a minute. Like, so I'm just giving you a warning. Rely on the friends to just think of those questions so that it won't happen after we finish this question. So I'm just about influences. And again, both you and I, we don't write the same book over and over again. And so I feel that with each book, there is sort of a different set of influences, or you can look at the book and say, oh, I see so-and-so in it. So I'm curious with this, because it is a different structure for you. And again, there have been some really, it taps into an interesting tradition of a certain kind of love story that transcends the present and the now to link back to the past and the future. So were there other authors, or are there stories that you had in your head as touch points, or do you tend to try to block it all out and just write?
I'm going to ask you the same question. Okay, all right. I'm like notoriously awful at remembering the books that I've read. So I'm trying to think of the best way to answer your question without dancing around it. I would say that for this book, music was a bigger influence. Juliana Barwick, her music is, so the songs that they hear, I did write and record those songs. There's a QR code in the back of the book and you can hear them, but it's not my voice that they're hearing, if that makes any sense. So like throughout the book, it's really based on an artist named Juliana Barwick, who I really, really love. A friend of mine, Nathaniel Ian Miller, wrote a novel called The Memoirs of Stockholm Sven, which I was just in love with. And it's a very wintry cabin in the snow, which at that cabin, I could not, there's no way I would be dead in days. Yeah, but music is, I feel like music's probably more of an influence for me. I mean, I'm a big reader, I'm constantly reading, but in terms of what I feel like influences my writing, like with my last novel, Electric Kingdom, it was Johan Johansson's music. Like listening to him made me, okay, this is the book I need to write. So do you feel, I mean, I know music obviously is not just a huge thing in your life, but also in your books. Would you say music is a primary influence for you?
Oh, totally. I mean, I think for some books more than others. I mean, I'm always listening to music as I'm playing. So as I'm playing, that was nice. As I'm writing, which is a form of play. And again, sometimes it's more deliberate than others. Oftentimes it is just what I happen to be listening to at that time. It's very rarely synced up to the actual thing that I'm writing, which like an attempt to soundtrack. So again, some more than others. Ryan and Avery, not as much. I mean, again, there was always music playing while I was writing, but it didn't influence as much as other books did. And for me, again, there wasn't a conscious like, oh, here's a book that covers 10 dates. That's what I want to do. And in fact, like I wanted to avoid the 10 dates concept of being the hook to the book. Like my publisher, God bless them, wanted like the title to be like the 10 dates of Ryan and Avery or our first 10 dates. And I was like, no. I think one influence that, and again, it's just a type of book I wanted it to be. It was interesting because if you look at the books that I write, you would think that I would have written this book in first person. That's just my default. All of my books with Rachel, like any back and forth. And I would alternate chapters between Ryan and Avery. And instead it became this third person sort of shifting perspective. And it's actually weighted more to Ryan than Avery. I didn't even try to make it equal. And part of that, like I love, like Eleanor and Park is a great example of, Eleanor Park is a book that I genuinely always forget whether it was written in first person or third person, because I felt that I was with the characters. The answer is it's in third person. But if you said it was in first person, I'd be like, of course, I love that voice. Right. So I did, because I was working with third person, I did think of books like that and be like, okay, I want to challenge myself to do a third person that is so intimate and observational that you feel like hopefully a year from now, somebody who's read Ryan and Avery will not remember whether it was in first person.
Yeah, and I love that you didn't do it in first person. And right off the bat, when I was reading, I was like, oh, interesting, okay. And I feel like it let you do, like your description of Avery's house, like it almost let you do some of those things that maybe, I mean, you could do in first person, but it wouldn't be quite as effective, I don't think.
Yeah, it's easier to do to pull back.
Yeah.
And I think both of our books, we have these passages which are wiser than our characters. I mean, and some of my favorite passages in your book, and I did not bring my copy with all the dog ears. I was going to embarrass you by reading them all out loud. But are when you can just sort of, you can essentialize something and articulate something that your character wouldn't necessarily know. And you as a person don't actually know until you're sitting there at the computer and writing it. You're like, oh,
I need to look this
wow,
up.
that is an interesting way of looking at the world. And I guess it was inside me this whole time. I love it when that happens. And I feel that those passages are usually readers' favorite passages in what I write.
Yeah.
All right, so I think the time has come to ask a question. So again, there's always the awkward pause where you stare at us, we stare at you, it's awkward. I'm actually talking through that awkward pause right now and hoping, thank you.
You're a wonderful writer and you're a wonderful editor. And I just wondered if you edit yourself or if you get all the edits that the rest of us do.
I get all the edits the rest of us do. I always, again, it's such an obscure reference that I always liken it to, there was this William Hurt movie in the early 1990s or even late 1980s called The Doctor, about like this hotshot doctor, a surgeon, and then he gets sick, and it's just so frustrating to him because he can't perform surgery on himself. And like half the movie is him realizing that actually cannot be done. And for me, it's the same way with editing. Like I know I would end up dead if I tried to perform surgery on myself. And so luckily I have been working with the same editor for 20 years. So we have a shorthand, we have a trust. So I know that I can give her something sloppy, which I do. And yeah, I think I'm lucky because I do think my brain does edit while I'm writing. So usually I don't have to revise too heavily. Usually it is in pretty good shape when it gets down. It's more the little things that I'm as blind to as any other author. And that's fine. I just accept that and I don't presume to actually know how to edit my own book, which is good.
When you're writing and then looking at the full novel, how do you decide what to cut and what to keep?
You're traumatized by that question.
Yeah, I know. I wish I had like a concise like trick or something. I mean, I think that the answer is you don't always, and that's where you rely on readers and editors. And then also it's like time and space, you know? So like I'll write something and sometimes I'm like, that's good. That's really good. And then I'll take a walk. And I'll come back and I'll read it like, oh, what was I thinking? That was awful. So it's just kind of like separating yourself from it, you know? I don't know. Is there a trick, David? Do you have a trick?
Yeah, I mean, again, you just have to trust your instinct as to what feels right. I mean, again, I think it absolutely has to be feedback from somebody else, whether it is your editor, or if you don't have an editor yet, having a friend that you trust, or having readers that you trust who can give you feedback. And then it is that gut instinct of like, after the initial defensiveness is over, like a few days later being like, oh, is what they're saying right or not? And then you ultimately get to decide. And I've absolutely had situations. I had a book called Love's the Higher Law, which was about sort of 3 kids in New York on 9/11 and the months afterwards. And I wrote it because I'd been in New York on that day. And so I basically made myself a character in the framing device and sort of just saying, this is what happened. And having sort of emails I'd written to my friends and things like that from those days as sort of the framework. And then the story of these 3 kids came around it. And sent it to my editor, and my editor said, I love the story of the 3 kids. I don't think the framing works at all. And of course, like my immediate reaction was like, that is the reason I wrote the book. Like that is like, how could you not, how could you take that out? It's so essential, like everything else is built around it. But again, we'd already worked on a couple of books together. I let it cool down, and then of course, went into the document, took those parts out very easily, and was like, oh, she's absolutely right. There's no reason for this to be here. It was the scaffolding I needed to build the building, but the building doesn't need the scaffolding after it's done. So I think there are times like that where it is somebody on the outside, you are so close to it. I never would have realized the scaffolding was scaffolding unless somebody pointed it out to me. And so that is what I do. The last thing I'm going to say, and I think this is a trick, which is extraordinarily helpful, is when I get my page proofs, I always read the book start to finish aloud to myself. And that makes you experience the book in a very different way. And for me, let me tell you, you can find the boring parts when you're reading out loud, because when you're editing your own stuff, if there's a boring part, you'll just skim over it. You'll be like, okay, this is just them walking to, like, when you're actually forcing yourself to read it aloud, suddenly you're like, I don't actually need to show them walking to the school and back, and like, I can just cut this because I'm bored saying it out loud. There's nothing interesting about this. And so that has actually helped me a lot. Again, very rarely does it show me something I'm missing. It usually shows me what I have too much of. So that's awesome. Yes, sir.
One thing I noticed is that you both write speculative YA fiction. And so I noticed that I Love You in Another Life sounds almost similar in concept to Every Day. And I'm curious what it is about that genre specifically that appeals to both of you. And if in any way, Every Day, whether consciously or not, you think played a role in writing that book.
Oh, I totally ripped it off. I'm kidding about that, but I'm super honored at that compare. I love Every Day. Also, the graphic novel, which just came out recently, you should all buy it. It's fantastic. Yeah, I don't know. I love speculative fiction because it allows me to. I think that reality is heightened when it's put next to unreality, and so you could make this book just Evan and Shosha's story. You could take out the vignettes altogether. Of course, then it's still got the music, and that doesn't, so maybe not, never mind. But I do feel like the real parts in this book are highlighted by the parts that are unreal. And it's just, for me, it's just more fun to kind of play in that space. That's not to say I'll always only ever write speculative. I'm working on 2 novels right now. One is totally realistic, and the other one is literally almost entirely set in a dream. So very not. But I love speculative. I love to read speculative. So yeah, I don't know, this isn't speculative, but you obviously have done a lot of it.
Yeah, no, I think for me, you said something the other night. When I write speculative, I think I'm writing realism, and then it's like, oh wait, it's speculative. Like, for Every Day, I had to approach it that, like, oh, this is the character's life. Like, this is waking up every day in a different body, a different life. That's just the way life is. And it wasn't until after I was done and it was published that Justine Lavalessiere, a fantasy writer, was like, oh, you wrote your first fantasy novel. And I was like, I did not write a fantasy novel or science fiction. And then it was nominated for a Hugo Award. And I was like, oh, I guess somebody else thinks it's science fiction or fantasy. But I think it is world building, it is all of that stuff, and it is completely blowing my mind to try to do that. I don't have that kind of writing brain, but it was my way of forcing myself to do it because there's a central conceit to it that I really like. But it is, again, approaching it as realism of like, oh, if I'm it is first person, so I'm in her life, what would it be like to be in this world? That's the only way I'm getting pages out, is to not think about the larger view and how does the world building work. It is like just by seeing the world through her eyes. And that's how my mind does it. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in how you find sources of generativity for your works, because I think, like many of the people in this audience, I'm a writer, and one of the things that I struggle with is how do I construct a plot based on an idea that is refined and planned, but not to the extent that there's no room for spontaneity, for randomness, for discovery along the way, and so that it's not so glossy that the reader kind of just slides right off and can't sink into the prose. So I'm wondering, like, how do you find sources of generativity? How does randomness intersect with pre-planned approaches to your novels? Do you have any thoughts on that kind of general topic?
I think everybody's writing mind works in different ways. And again, I have now worked with hundreds of authors as an editor, and it's always fascinating to me to see that there are the pantsers and the plotters, the people who go by the seat of their pants. I am like a dictionary definition of that. I never outline, I never do anything. On the other end, I always use my friend Judy Blundell, who won the National Book Award for What I Saw in Highlight, as the opposite, that she will write like an 80-page out. But it still feels real to her, even though she knows every beat of what's going to happen. Then for her, voice takes over. That she doesn't have the voice when she's outlining, but then when she writes, the voice is the thing that is generated to her. For me, being more bare bones about it, the only thing I really have when I start a book is a conceit. And I am very much a conceit-driven, one might even say conceited, author, and that is the thing that interests me in a project. When I'm like, what am I going to write next? It isn't a character, it isn't a voice, it isn't a theme necessarily, it isn't a setting. And again, many other authors, any of those things could spark where they go. For me, it is what is the structure of the story. So again, for Ryan and Avery, it's going to be 10 dates, and I'm going to like look at these 10 dates under a microscope. And that was all I needed. Obviously that gave me, I knew sort of roughly how long it would go. I knew what the pacing would be, like, oh, if we're on the 5th date, this is the action that's halfway through the book. But whatever happened within it, I was free to do whatever, and obviously sort of change it up as I wanted. Again, every day it was wake up every day in a different body, different life. I knew that every chapter was going to be a different body and a different life, and that would give me sort of 2 things to play with. I would have the regular narrative, which is very linear, but then every chapter I would be changing things up massively and could add the spontaneity of like, well, who is A, waking up as, and how will that affect the bigger story? So I think trying to figure out what the conceit is that you want, and again, not all books have to have conceits, but for me and my writing mind, that actually helps me. That is the skeleton rather than an outline from which I build the body of the book.
I love a good meander in life, in reading, in writing. I just love, I'm a meanderer. In fact, my 3rd book is almost entirely meandering. Too much meandering, some might say. But it's a struggle for me because I just want to go, who cares, let's just go. So what I end up doing is I don't outline, but I do for every manuscript, I have 2 documents. I have a manuscript and I have like an idea dump. So it's not an outline necessarily, but I will have along the way different ideas for conversations, for characters, for things that happen, and I just throw it in that file in the same way that you would throw stuff. And then it also serves a nice, it's like, then on the days where the real manuscript, where the writing is hard, I can just go organize that closet. So you're still being productive and you're still working on your book, but yeah, so it's not, I don't do no outlining, but I definitely don't do an outline. It's more just sort of like an idea dump. So I don't know if that's helpful or not.
That is helpful, thank you both.
So we are the 3rd most, the state of Missouri is the
I know
3rd
you're
most
going with
banned books in the state, in the United States.
Yes.
So I am
Congratulations.
wondering if, thank you, you're on that list, so welcome. I'm wondering if that goes into the way that you write, if now so many books have been banned or challenged that it affects the ideas that you have and the things that you are writing, or if you are like throwing things to the wind.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it doesn't affect it at all. I mean, like, there is no chilling effect. If anything, there's a warming effect. Like, that it is seeing the value of the stories that we put out there makes us want to do it more, even if they are going to be attacked. And I think a lot of what I do in both of my roles as an author and as an editor and publisher is to just tell, especially other queer authors, that don't let any censor's voice get into your head. That we just have to keep telling our stories. And I think that is ultimately what is going to win this fight, is that we are all going to keep telling our stories, and that there are just too many of us to actually erase. I mean, I'm going to, David's heard this so many times, but my favorite statistic of the book banning statistics, which again, it's a little weird to have the favorite statistic, and we'll start with you going, that's actually really bad, and then I promise I'm going to turn it. But again, the last Penn report, over 2,500 books, individual books, have been censored in the school year, or have been challenged in the school year, or banned in the school year. 2,500. Of those books, 40% of them are LGBTQIA+ titles. So I'm not usually a math expert, but this was really convenient because 40% of 2,500 is 1,000. And so on the one hand, it's horrifying that there are these many books that are being challenged. On the other hand, 1,000 books is a lot of books. And that represents a huge amount of effort on the part of authors, publishers, booksellers to take a body of literature that when I started with, it is easy to erase a dozen books. It is impossible to erase 1,000 books. It is even more impossible to erase 2,500 books. And so I think that one of the things we have to really double down on is that the fight against book banning is always much easier when you have a whole lot of books that are representing a whole lot of voices. And again, one of the reasons it was so threatening in the 50s and 60s and 70s is that our literature was so small and there were so few targets. They're still using the same playbook from the 60s and 70s, but the literature has changed massively. And of course, access to the literature has changed massively. So they're fighting a losing battle. They just want to really, really exhaust us in the process. And they're doing a very good job of that. But again, to go back to your initial question, that the way we fight is to write. And to have the books on tables like you do, and to proudly publish them. And that's exactly what we're going to do. And then we are going to challenge these laws, as we are, and eventually we hope that sanity will prevail and they will be overturned. And we'll look back and be like, look at this attempt, this completely political attempt that happened to end the freedom to read in America, but we defended it and we did not back down and we did not censor ourselves because of it. Yeah, Missouri. When I saw that, I was like, I mean, Pennsylvania was the old number 3, which was also surprising. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
All right, there are other questions. Yes.
One I like the parts about like each of your books is that you kind of create these characters that go through like experience or like big experiences. So I guess like where you have like any advice on like creating these characters that kind of seem to pop out of pages that
Are you Audrey?
Yes.
It is so nice to meet you. We're gonna talk. Yeah, characters. Like how do you create characters? What's the character? It kind of feels. I mean, it's like the old in Stephen King's On Writing, where it feels like you're dusting away something that was already there. It doesn't feel like you're creating a thing. I don't know. Do you? I also feel like it's different for every book. Like sometimes I'll know a character right away. I've had a couple of books where, like, from page 1, I knew exactly who the character was. And then I've had a couple of books where it's like, man, how am I going to figure this person out? Like, I don't. Give me tricks, David. I feel like
Well, I mean, I think I do. I mean, honestly, it is as oversimplistic as this answer is. I'm going to go with it anyway. But it's always making sure my characters are messy. And I think that is something that I absolutely do when I'm revising, is that when I'm writing them, they do feel real to me, and I do feel that I am channeling something on them. So one of the reasons hopefully they feel real to the reader is because I believe it when I'm writing it. It's sincere. But at the same time, I think that a lot of the times, again, it's a good analogy you made that they feel like friends, and it's a lot of times my first draft is like, if you ask me about my best friends, I wouldn't tell you the things about them that annoy me. I wouldn't tell you about like the ways that they messed up. I wouldn't tell you about their flaws. I would tell you about why I like them so much. And because I want them to just be very likable. And I think that's my first draft, is often putting their best foot forward. And then when I'm revising, I'm like, well, I have to actually acknowledge the flaws. I have to acknowledge the messiness, because that is why they feel real. And that you can relate to them is that sometimes they do the right thing and other times they do the wrong thing. And so I do actually like think about that when I'm reading it over. So after I've stepped back and returning to it, I'm like, are there characters who seem a little too good, or conversely seem one note in their badness? Because people aren't like that. They have all those sides to them. And I think the job of a novelist is, even for the minor characters, to try to show as many of the sides as possible. So I sort of give them that test of am I being too nice to them, or am I being too mean to them? And usually my revisions are better because I'm making it more confident.
I think it also is a natural, like your character development so frequently for me is like a natural result of an effort on my part to never describe the thing, but to describe how the thing makes the character feel. And so when you pivot away from what's happening or what the thing is, and you're pivoting into how does that thing make that character feel, you're just sort of naturally going to be diving more into the character. So that's something if I'm just describing sometimes you have to just describe, right? But if there's ever a chance for me to not describe something, but to describe how it makes the character feel, I go for that. We're gonna talk.
Quick question. How do you decide to write in present or past tense? Or do you vary it or?
I mean, I completely vary it. And I think it is for me, it is and I'm extremely mindful of this as an editor as well. To me, it's almost about the knowledge of the narrative voice. That it is, if it's present tense, usually that means that my characters don't know what's going to happen next. They don't know the context of the story. They're sort of riding along the story with the reader. They are no smarter than the reader as far as what's going on. And a lot of the times, especially in my collaborations, we do present tense because it's the immediacy of it. It is that there's no foreshadowing, there's no setting something up for later, because it is just the characters and I as the writer are living in the moment. Past tense to me is perspective. It means that usually the narrative voice does know where it's going. They are more observational. They are sort of telling the story from a different vantage point. And it could be from the moment the book ends, it could be from 10 years later, but there is that authority that past tense has, whereas present tense has more uncertainty. So for me, and again, it's very rare that I sit down to write a story and consciously make a decision. It's sort of whatever is there and feels right. But I will admit, I have had some really extraordinarily acclaimed novelists hand me manuscripts. I will tell the story. Probably my favorite novelist, or one of my favorite novelists, is Alice Hoffman. And I was very lucky. Her editor at Scholastic had left, so I became her editor. And I was like, must not be too worshipful, must play it cool, don't be a fanboy. And she handed in her book. It was gorgeous, the prose was amazing, and it was in the wrong tense. And I was like, I can't believe I have to do this, but I talked to her. I was like, I know this is presumptuous. And I think I went through the first chapter and I actually put it in past tense to show her, or present, I can't remember which flip it was. But I was like, I would like you to try this because I think the book is in the wrong tense. And of course, at first she was like, I think you're crazy, but I'll try it. And then she ultimately did change it, which was such a pain to do. Luckily, it was a very short book, but she had to go through literally every sentence and change the tense. But the book was exponentially better because of that. So again, there is an instinct involved with it too.
Yeah, and for me, it is all about the instinct and then trusting my editor to tell me if my instinct is wrong. But my friend and author Jeff Sentner, if you guys haven't read his books, you should. We have a writing workshop called Writing by Ear, because neither one of us went to school for it. Neither one of us have MFAs, which is another thing I love when I talk with young people who want to be an author. I often say, well, if you write, you're a writer, so claim that. You can aspire to be an author, but you can't aspire to be a writer. If you've written something, you're a writer. And the other thing I say is the only qualification you need to write is to be a human. So that's where the instinct comes in, and you just kind of have to go with it and then trust the people in your circles.
E.T. could not be a writer.
What? Oh. No, E.T. E.T. could be a writer.
All right, any last questions, or are we good to wrap up? All right, I think we're good to wrap up.
Thank you guys so much.
We do have a very, very large selection of books available for sale at the desk, including both of the brand new books from each author. If you are looking for a specific title, and don't see it, let me know. But we're going to set up this table right in the front of the room. So if you'll give us just a second while you go and purchase books or do that thing.
It's so good. After this May and every few months, it's such
I bought it because you told me to, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
So I'm gonna hand this to you.
Oh, we know.
Larry's speaking about it.
You want me to show
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, don't worry.
I mean, just from author events, like we
Hang out at other events?
yeah, back in the day, the very start.